Okay. I got cold, so I came inside. But so, I mean, in the last chapter, in chapter 6, they are crossing the prairie. If you look at the map, um, you can see where they are. Sorry, glare. But there's a section right here. Can't really see it on mine, but it says Kaw Indians. So that shows us where they are. So they still have a long, long, long ways to go, don't they? Chapter 7 is called On the Banks of the Big Blue. The meadows we were traveling through were still beautiful and full of flowers, wild roses, honeysuckle, and tulips. Mrs. Donner went gathering them with the children. She said that as long as there were Indians around, she wanted to keep the youngsters in sight. You never can tell when they might take a notion they'd like to carry a white baby back to their village along with the buttons and beads and food they get from us, she said to Patty's mother. Mrs. Reed agreed with her and was grateful to her for keeping an eye on the Reed children, too, while she was watching over Grandma. The old lady's cough had taken a turn for the worse. It's the damp weather, Mrs. Reed told Mrs. Donner. If only we could get into higher, drier country. I feel sure she would improve. She's far from her old, lively self these last few days. But dear Grandma never got to drier country. On the evening of May 26th, we camped on the banks of the Big Blue River, expecting to cross it next day. But there had been so many rains lately, and the stream was so much swollen and rushing with a strong, rapid current, which rose that night until the muddy waters were even with the top of its banks, that we had to remain encamped there for several days, while the men set to work to build a ferry boat to get the wagons across. Grandma's cough continued to get worse. Eliza kept a kettle of tea hot on the little stove in the palace car, and all night long Mrs. Reed sat by her bed ministering to her needs. Peeping out from under Patty's pillow, I could see the worried lines on her tired face, and I knew that all was not well with Grandma. On the third night we had been encamped on the Big Blue, Grandma had a bad spell. Her cough kept the children awake, and Patty and Puss went up to the second story of the wagon, where the boys were put to bed to quiet them and tell them stories until they went to sleep. After a while, Grandma's coughing stopped, and the girls, too, dropped off to sleep. Perhaps poor Grandma will be better now, I thought, and Mrs. Reed can get some rest. Everything was still for a long while. Then I heard quiet sobbing and Mr. Reed's low voice. In the morning he came up to tell the children that their dear grandma had come as far as she was able. We would have to go the rest of the way west without her. They all cried, and their father tried to comfort them by saying that the angels had come to take Grandma so she wouldn't suffer any more. Everything was quiet in camp that day. The boat building stopped, and the carpenters went to work building a coffin from a big cottonwood tree, and that afternoon Grandma was buried in a flowery meadow under an oak tree. The Reverend Mr. Cornwall, who was in the party, read the service, and John Denton, a teamster with the Donner family, who had been a stonecutter, made a marker for her grave. It's a short chapter, but very sad. I know Patty had a good relationship with her grandmother. I don't know. I think Grandma's probably happy to be buried um, on the frontier under an oak tree. I think she liked adventure, and I think she's. I don't think she'd regret making the decision to go with them. But that's my opinion. Anyways, so make sure you do your questions, write complete sentences, do your best always, right?